So the Stoics argued that one is ought to have a fatalistic attitude. That is, that they ought to love their fate, no matter what it is. And so Epictetus, for instance, says that we're all actors on the stage and that each person is ought to love the role that they're assigned and play it to the best of their ability. So this idea of loving one's fate, and especially as it's posed by Epictetus, is meant to maximize one's sense of freedom. So for Epictetus, for example, he says, do not wish for events to happen as you wish them to, but rather wish them to happen as they do happen, and all will be well with you. So the idea here is not to have a defeatist mentality whereby you don't engage in any activities or desires. The idea here is that you are unattached to outcomes, but at the same time focused on the processes and methodologies by which you achieve outcomes. And so the idea here is to maximize one's sense of freedom and to maximize happiness while minimizing the potentiality of misery. And so here it's pivotal to talk about Epictetus's idea of the dichotomy of control. Some say there's a trichotomy of control, and I agree with that. But the idea here is that you focus on what's within the bounds of your control and neglect and not worry about matters which rest outside the bounds of your control. So for Epictetus, those things are externals. The things that rest outside the bounds of one's control are externals or indifference. And so the idea with Epictetus is discussion on loving one's fate, on being an actor on a stage and loving one's role that they're assigned, is that there is no point in resisting matters which are outside the bounds of your control and outside the domain of your control. And so rather, what you have to do is simply play your role to the best of your ability. And also, there is no point in focusing your energy on things that are external and outside the bounds of your control. So rather, focus on yourself. In Stoicism, that is the idea of virtue, which is the only good in Stoicism, and which is the only prerequisite to happiness. In addition, the Stoics say that in addition to living a virtuous life as a prerequisite to happiness, they also suggest that living in accordance to nature leads you to happiness. So there's a parallel, there's a link, and there's an interconnectedness here between living in accordance to nature and living virtuously. And so to live in accordance to nature and to live virtuously, these are things that are interconnected with one another in accordance to the Stoics. What has to be recognized here is that Epictetus himself was enslaved. And for Epictetus, even though you can be enslaved, you can still be a free man. If you follow his philosophy and understand what is within your control and what is outside the bounds of your control. And so by focusing on the process and not the outcome of a particular event, you maximize the potentiality of success, but more importantly, you maximize the potentiality of happiness, and you minimize the potentiality of misery. So for the Stoics, there's no point in focusing on indifference and externals, since virtue is the only good and it's the only prerequisite to happiness. In addition, if you focus on externals and indifference, then you are living in disagreement with nature. That is, if you do not love your fate, then you are living in disagreement with nature. And for the Stoics, living in agreement with nature leads to happiness, and thus the opposite of that, living in disagreement with nature, leads to one's misery. So I think the reasoning behind Epictetus's work here on loving one's fate and understanding what's within your control and what's outside the bounds of your control is to maximize the sense of one's freedom. Here, freedom is not the typical freedom that we think of in the modern age, such as living in a fruitful democracy with freedom of speech and so forth and so on. For Epictetus, again, you can be an enslaved person and still be free, so long as you conquer yourself, so long as you conquer your desires, and so long as you live virtuously and in accordance with nature. You can be free in accordance to Epictetus.